Thanks for joining us, everybody. The topic of today's webcast is how attackers exploit Active Directory, lessons learned from high-profile breaches, sponsored by Semperis and presented by redmondmag.com. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. There will be a Q&A session toward the end of today's presentation, so please type any questions you may have in the Q&A box. Semperis has provided some resources, which will be posted in chat, so please take a moment to check those out. Finally, the webcast is being recorded, so keep an eye out for a link in your email to rewatch the presentation or share it with a colleague. Let me introduce today's speakers. Brian Desmond is principal of Ravenswood Technology Group. Brian helps commercial enterprise and higher education customers solve problems surrounding enterprise mobility, Active Directory, identity management, and Office 365. Brian was recognized annually as a Microsoft MVP for identity and access management for 15 years for his contributions to the Microsoft technical communities at large. Brian is the author of Active Directory 5th edition, published by O'Reilly, as well as a frequent contributor to leading industry publications. Ron Harrell is Principal Security Product Manager at Semperis. Ron has over 15 years security experience, including pen testing, security operations, and risk and compliance management at global financial institutions. Recently, Ron has held leading product roles at a global cybersecurity vendor and 2 acquired startups. He's also the product manager for Purple Knight, Semperis's free Active Directory security assessment tool. Welcome, gentlemen, both of you.
Hi, Brian. Hi, Sean. Nice to be here.
You'd have to have been living under a rock for the last year or the last part of the beginning of this year to have missed the significant cybersecurity events so far this year. I mean, it seems to be changing on a week-to-week basis. We have the SolarWinds supply chain attack that compromised that company's Orion network software and allowed Russian threat actors to infiltrate thousands of organizations. We have the Hafnium exchange zero-day attack that the Chinese and then later other groups used zero-day exploits and exchange web-facing servers to infiltrate, again, thousands of organizations. Just recently, we had the Colonial Pipeline attack by the DarkSide ransomware group that, besides shutting down the fuel supply to the East Coast, marked an escalation in attacking infrastructure services. And all we have to do is look in the last couple of days, if you haven't heard the news, of the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, essentially the New York subway, has also been attacked. And then last but certainly not least, the Irish Health Services, where a ransomware attack crippled health services all across Ireland. The common thread in all of this is exploitation of Active Directory. In this talk, Brian and Ron will examine these attacks, and they will talk about how Active Directory is related to these attacks and about Active Directory protection. Note that this is not a technical talk, but it's an analysis of these events, and most importantly, how to prevent or help prevent your organization from being added to this list. First, let's have a poll. So this always is helpful to gauge where people stand in this organization. So in this meeting, rather, in which areas of Active Directory security do you have the least confidence? Kerberos security, group policy security, account security, Active Directory delegation, AD infrastructure security, or others. So we've got results coming in. It's always interesting to see this happen interactively as you see the different categories go up and down. And once it settles just a little bit, we will publish it out. Okay, I think we're just about there. So in the poll results, what we're seeing here, I assume that you can see all of this. The poll results that we're seeing is that account security is the highest at 28% in areas of concern or least confidence, closely followed by AD infrastructure security at 24%. Very interesting. So let's launch off of that and talk about some of these areas. So what we see, this is the wrong one. Sorry about that. There we go. So here's some interesting numbers associated around Active Directory and not necessarily in a good way. So Mandiant Incident Response Consulting has said that 90% of the customers that they've worked with in their breaches have had Active Directory involved some way as some part of an access vector or deeply involved in the breach, whether it was the threat actors using it as a methodology for gaining further access or involved in some way, shape, or form. 90% of companies that were breached had Active Directory involved in it some way. Now, the math is sort of simple on this. According to Microsoft, 95% of the Fortune 1000 companies use Active Directory. So there's kind of an analogy between why do you see more viruses in Windows than you do for Macs, because the bad guys go, the bank robbers go where the banks are. So Active Directory is there, and Active Directory, and it's widespread throughout the world. So let's go after that. According to Forrester, then 80% of breaches involve the abuse of privileged accounts. And as Ron and Brian will talk about, that goes hand in hand with what happens in Active Directory attacks. Semperis offers Purple Knight, which is a free security assessment tool that has been used by well over 1,000 organizations to evaluate their Active Directory security. So that is, we have made, for the purposes of this seminar, we've made it available here in chat for you to be able to download and perform your own free security assessment. Of the companies that have shared their results with us, Purple Knight has revealed an average score of about 61%. And it varies from category to category. The worst score was Kerberos Security at 43% of an average. And the second worst was Group Policy at only 58%. So really not particularly great. Now, Active Directory, as you well know, is, of course, if it's being used by so many organizations, it's being used to manage millions of identities. And yet it's no longer being developed by Microsoft. It's supported, but it's considered to be a mature product. And there has been very, very little in any way, shape, or form of development in the last probably 8 or 9 years. So why is it so ubiquitous? Because number one, it still works. It still works, and it supports the on-premises organizations around the world, and it supports the applications that are critical to businesses all around the world. It's very versatile, and it's in the phrase technical debt. It's very, very expensive to replace. People can talk about replacing Active Directory, but to do it is, in most circumstances, just too expensive to do, because Active Directory is such a critical part of the infrastructure. It's part and parcel with what we consider to be a working enterprise today. Whoops, sorry about that. Ron,
Right,
do you want to talk to that? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yes, so as Sean mentioned, we'll be covering several attacks from the past months, and unfortunately, these just keep happening, right? JBS, Fujitsu from today in Japan, and we're probably going to hear about more and more of these. And the way that we're going to be describing these attacks is using the MITRE ATT&CK framework that's also integrated into all of our products. And the reason why we're going to do it this way is, for those that are unfamiliar with this framework, is that it was designed to describe attacks in a way that creates these chains, right? In order for an attack to be considered successful and impactful, the attacker has to do several things, right? Most of the attack stories that we're going to cover are known either for for the companies they hit or for their initial penetration method, right? SolarWinds, Hafnium, or the exchange 0-day, and so on. But really, to describe attacks, we have to talk about the different stages. And the different stages of the attacks are covered in MITRE. And a lot of them involve Active Directory, as we'll see, usually for lateral movement or for privilege escalation, but also for other tactics, for other stages of attacks. And describing it this way, describing all of the attacks in a similar way, helps us learn what we can do, learn of the similarities between the different attacks, and how we can protect ourselves going forward. So let's start with SolarWinds. So we've all heard of this attack. This is actually, this started last year. Probably some estimate that the first attacks were from around March. SolarWinds, the SolarWinds Orion platform is an IT infrastructure management widely adopted by many large enterprises. And they were actually infiltrated sometime in 2019, it is believed. And then the hackers there, who are believed to be Russian, were able to insert malicious code into their update mechanism for Orion. That's why this is called a supply chain attack. Basically, the companies that bought their product were then vulnerable to a code base that they received from their suppliers. Right. This makes it very, very damaging. There's really, for a customer of SolarWinds or any company that's subverted this way, there's little to no way for them to protect themselves. Right. Supply chain attacks have become more prevalent in recent years, and it's a real danger to the entire stack. It's believed that around 18,000 organizations were vulnerable to this attack, meaning that they had this product installed and they got that malevolent update at some point. It's currently not known exactly how many were compromised. They're thinking that thousands of companies were compromised, government agencies, cybersecurity companies, even Microsoft at some point were also compromised by this attack, although they said that none of their production code base was affected by this, and no data was lost. And we're going to look specifically here at an investigation that FireEye did about of an attack that followed the supply chain attack, right? The complete attack chain. And Sean, you can move to the next slide, please. And what's interesting here is that this specific attack culminated in probably one of the most advanced Active Directory attacks. It's called Golden Ticket or GoldenSAML. And what this eventually enabled the attackers was through Active Directory to reach this specific company's Office 365 and Azure infrastructure out in the cloud, right? So usually we'll hear about attackers getting in through the cloud. In this case, they actually managed to attack the cloud through the internal infrastructure, right? So when we look at it from an attack chain perspective, the SolarWinds aspect was just the initial access part, right? They used malware called SolarBurst to get in. Once they were in, they enumerated the entire domain. Because this is IT infrastructure management platform, it's safe to assume that immediately they were able to access very highly privileged credentials. Once they did that, they were able to access the domain controllers and get into the Active Directory Federation Services master key, which basically signs the SAML tokens. It is able to mint access to any cloud service that is federated to Active Directory. At that point, they pretty much had access to anything in the cloud that was federated within that environment. Impact here is assessed around well, $18 million to SolarWinds. but all of the victims of this attack were left with persistent access, in addition to data theft and potential ransomware. Brian, what do you think about this? How would you go about remediating something like this, or even preventing something like this?
Yeah, I think the part about the GoldenSAML, or the being able to take the what are called the token signing certificate in ADFS, and there's a similar concept in any federation platform, whether that's one in the cloud or another one that you run, be it an ADFS or a ping or something like that. Is that people don't really think about how important it is to protect that key. I think there's been a lot of focus over the past several years around protecting privileged credentials, for example, in AD or other systems. But those certificates and the private keys, namely in ADFS, for example, are really just kind of out there. And like you said, the risk here is that if someone gets a copy of it, they can create tokens for access to any application that's federated with that, whether that's Office 365, which means you can log in essentially undetected as any user, because you never even need their credentials to get in, or any other application. And it puts a lot of focus on, do you either need to just migrate to a cloud-based platform, for example, Azure AD or any number of competing ones, or do you need to take more steps to protect that, like putting those private keys in a hardware security module, which for anyone that runs a PKI environment, they're probably familiar with. But often the thought of using HSMs, hardware security modules, outside the realm of PKI often doesn't come up. But it's a really powerful protection that would have, in many cases, prevented being able to steal that key.
Right, thanks. And this is an advanced attack, right? So we're going to see some ransomware attacks, which occur very frequently nowadays. And you know, GoldenSAML, Golden Ticket, getting to the keys. The AD just holds very sensitive stuff, right? I mean, being able to get domain admin, which in the case of an attack like this probably happened fairly quickly in the attack cycle. They could have easily had access anywhere within the domain, probably from the get-go, right?
I think there's some irony in the fact that for many years, ADFS was considered the security standard for authenticating to the cloud, and yet it became such a clear attack vector in this advanced attack.
Right. All right, so let's move on to Exchange, Ode, and Hafnium. So this started in January when a Taiwanese company, DevCore, announced that it was looking into several Exchange vulnerabilities, and immediately the attack started, large scale. And this makes sense actually, because for government-backed agencies who think that their exploits are going to be burned, this would be a good time for them to use them before the patch comes out. So it would make sense that if they got wind of somebody who was going to discover these exploits, they'd want to create as many backdoors and get as much data they can before they lose those exploits. And it seems that this is what happened. It's believed that Hafnium, which is a code name for a Chinese group, believed to be tied to the Chinese government. They began several companies began to see a lot of traffic around these exploits. Microsoft eventually released out-of-band patches for these in March, but this, you know, these are actually several chained exploits for on-prem Exchange servers who have Outlook Web Access enabled. There's thousands, tens of thousands of these on the internet. There's still vulnerable servers out there right now. Very quickly, once the patches were released and reverse engineered, a lot of different organizations started abusing these as well. So, you know, there's been thousands and thousands of these hacks, right? So next slide, please. Right, so what this actually does is it allows access to the Exchange server, right? And the Hafnium attacks themselves also implemented web shells for communications into the environment. So that's the initial access and the control path, the C2 channels into the environment. But once this access was enabled, of course, immediately lateral movement and privilege escalation, right? So it's always the same case. They get in, they establish their access, they establish the communication channels, and immediately they start manipulating the environment. In this case, the response or the investigations showed that what they did was they started harvesting data, right? So of course the Exchange mailboxes and all of the data related to that, but also the copies of the AD databases, the Git files, right? What this enabled them to do is dump credentials for breaking the passwords and being able to use that later on for access down the road once they lose these initial channels, right? Additionally, some analysis also showed that they implanted additional credentials for persistence as well. And it's believed that just from sheer numbers, this was actually a more devastating attack than the SolarWinds hack, which was back in the day, it was the most devastating attack. So let's move on to ransomware. Oh, sorry, Brian. Yeah, go ahead with what would be the way to remediate this?
I think for many organizations, we see relatively few on-premises Exchange customers anymore. Email is kind of a bit of an appliance or a utility at this point, and that there's not a lot of value for the vast majority of organizations to run that on premises. And in fact, we're hearing from some of our customers that have not yet made the move to Exchange Online that they're actually seeing increases in their cyber insurance policy costs if they continue to run Exchange on premises, and that's creating in some cases a very real cost, even on top of what the potential incremental monthly cost would be to go to Exchange Online. So I think this is one of those where if you're still running Exchange on premises, there's some hard questions to be asked about whether that's really adding value, and whether you're better off, kind of outsourcing that to Microsoft and focusing on bigger and better things.
Right. Would there be any reason for companies today to keep an Exchange server on-prem?
Traditionally there's still technical requirements that Microsoft hasn't removed, where you need to have a limited number of Exchange servers on premises to provide some of the interoperability and management with Office 365. And of course, those are vulnerable as well to this attack because they need to be exposed to the internet. But there are steps that you can take to lessen the privileges that Exchange has in AD, and Microsoft's even done that in patches for Exchange over the past year or so. But of course, that depends on customers deploying those patches, which even today continues to be a discussion that we have, where people are not on top of that. But beyond that, we still see some limited things around things like data sovereignty and some very limited compliance requirements. But by and large, Microsoft has taken the steps to be able to solve those.
Thank you.
I find it fascinating that, given what we've seen with Hafnium and these other attacks, that organizations have any reason for not deploying patches right away, and a business reason, given the risk that this shows.
And Exchange in particular can be a little bit of a bear to patch, especially if it's still hosting data. It's not as simple as running a patch and rebooting Windows 15 minutes later. So there's I can understand why it can be challenging for people to get it done, but that's unfortunately still not an excuse.
Shall I move on?
Yeah. So let's talk about Colonial Pipeline. So this attack, this is the ransomware attack on the Eastern Seaboard Pipeline. We've all heard of this one, and I think Steve mentioned in the chat, the shutdown of the pipeline was not due to the attack itself, but either a precautionary measure or a money-saving measure. Depends on who you listen to. And actually, I have to say, I've seen companies that run physical infrastructure where there can actually be access from the IT infrastructure, to the SCADA network, to the physical infrastructure through jump terminals and things like that. So you could have a PC that's connected to AD that then has terminal services to the physical infrastructure. So it is believable that is a precaution, that it was a precautionary measure, although the other stories make sense as well. So the story here is that DarkSide, a ransomware as a service group from Russia, carried out this attack. They've been actually very profitable. They've been carrying out hundreds of attacks. They have a whole manifesto of companies or organizations that they won't attack. They claim to vet every single one of their customers' requests. Their customers are criminals that want to make some money, make some bitcoins, so they use their service to ransomware other companies, and they'll just make a lot of money that way. So what's interesting here, Sean, next slide, please. What's interesting here is that their DarkSide is not a new group, and their methods are not very dissimilar to other ransomware as a service groups, in that they use known tools, right? Specifically here, and we'll also see that in the next case as well. They like to use Cobalt Strike. Cobalt Strike, for those that don't know, was originally a penetration testing tool, right? It's a very user-friendly. It provides a very good UI for kind of getting a view of what you're doing as a penetration tester, and deploying shellcode, deploying exploits, establishing communication C2 channels, so you can actually control all of the various endpoints and servers that you took advantage of. You have a nice ordered list of the users that you compromised. It's very user friendly. It's like it's like Google Maps for your hacked victim. Very fun to use, and the criminals are using it. Why not? It's very powerful. Any new exploit that comes out can be immediately integrated into that. And what we see in these types of attacks is that first of all, they're not automated, right? So this is something that is called a human operated ransomware attack. So they'll get in, and then they'll take their time before they actually deploy the ransomware itself. And what they'll do is lateral movement and privilege escalation, right? What we always see. Enumerate the domain, dump all the credentials they can, get the lay of the land, and see if there's anything more they can get. Of course, they also download any interesting data, so they can get ransom for the data as well. Sometimes they'll do persistence. They'll do stuff like DC sync using Mimikat, so they can have a copy of a domain controller. So later on, they can get more credentials and have access later on, even if and when the organization recovers afterwards, right? And for this specific attack, we all heard about the impact here, disruption of about almost 50% of fuel distribution to the eastern U.S. I think this was the first time that ransomware actually had a real world impact on people's lives. That's why it made such headlines. But as far as the modus operandi goes, as far as the attack methods, it's really in line with all of the ransomware as a service trend that is just happening nonstop these days. So Brian, looking at this, seeing that there's so many ways for attackers to get in, and by the way, in this case, they got in probably through phishing emails, right? So there was no O-Day here. There was no super vulnerability here. It was probably through phishing, and the usual ways, right? So once attackers are in, and now they have Active Directory laid out in front of them, they can dump credentials and do things like that. What should companies look out for?
Yeah, so you kind of joked about Cobalt Strike being easy to use. You know, Mimikatz is decidedly not easy to use, but it's incredibly powerful, and it's something that you know, many of these attacks use because it enables attackers to harvest credentials from not only the system that they're on, but as they escalate privileges, to potentially harvest credentials from all of AD. So one of the things we often talk to our customers about as we talk about how do we harden an AD environment, how do we harden a Windows environment, is, you know, stopping lateral movement as close to the edge as we can. And for many organizations, that's something can be as simple as, you know, removing or having a random local admin password on every server on every workstation. You know, traditionally companies had a well-known local admin password that was the same on every workstation, for example, so the help desk could easily support that. As an attacker, once I can get control of that and understand what that credential is on one machine, if it works across all my workstations, that enables them to move, you know, laterally and hopscotch from workstation to workstation until they can escalate privileges and start that all again. So deploying a solution like LAPS, the local admin password solution from Microsoft, is incredibly important to help prevent that. Also doing things like making sure that there aren't tens or hundreds of domain accounts nested in local administrators on a given workstation or server that would be used to manage it. Now, if I can get control of one of those, again, I can move across the board. So that's super important, and something that can take typically not so much technical changes as some IT support process changes that can be challenging sometimes, but it makes these scenarios where someone's able to get in with something like a phishing attack and then move across the environment much harder for the attacker.
Okay. And we have a question here. We have a question here about Credential Guard or recovering data that's not Active Directory. You have any comment about that?
Credential Guard is definitely something that should be deployed, and it does make the job of something like Mimikatz a whole lot harder. Part of what Credential Guard does is that it virtualizes part of the LSAS process that runs on every Windows machine and has since the Windows NT days, and that's really where those password hashes are stored. Active Directory itself actually runs inside the LSAS process on domain controllers, and it makes the techniques that tools like Mimikatz use to capture the memory from LSAS and extract those password hashes much harder. So it's a really important safeguard to deploy.
All right, thank you. And yeah, and one of the things that we see, Sean mentioned at the beginning, Purple Knight and our DSP product, and these are the things we look for, right? So is LAPS implemented? If it is implemented, how well is it implemented? And really how secure all the various aspects of your AD infrastructure is against these types of attacks. All right, so let's move on to our last attack of today. While we're gathering plenty more. So the Irish Health Services, right? And this is once again another case of ransomware affecting a whole, in this case, a whole country's infrastructure, pretty much, right? In this case, it's Ireland, and here we're seeing, you know, a drop of about 50% of the country's health services capabilities, and it's you know, it's these sorts of things are devastating, right? I mean, if you have an important appointment to a doctor and it gets postponed because of this. I actually looked it up today. They still, according to their website, they still haven't fully recovered, right? So they're still not back on track. In this case, this was a group called Wizard Spider. They're a bit more automated than DarkSide. They're a bit lower profile. They actually are known to attack a lot of healthcare providers around the world. In this case, they hit a whole country, but a lot of different healthcare providers in the ransomware that we hear about day in, day out, from hospitals and places like that, they were hit by this group, once again out of Russia, and you know, the same sort of kill chain here, right? So next slide, please. Right, so we're looking at initial access once again, a lot of phishing, a lot of Windows vulnerabilities, a lot of browser vulnerabilities, and just kind of I hate to say it, but it's the normal way of getting in, right? The easy way of getting in, kind of the low-hanging fruit. There's still not enough adequate solutions to prevent the basic phishing and spear phishing email-based attacks. And once they're in, it's privilege escalation and lateral movement again, right? So the question becomes, how do you deploy your malware as fast as you can and as wide as you can? And you do that by getting privileged credentials. And you go in, you use Cobalt Strike. These guys also use Cobalt Strike, and you dump credentials from endpoints, and you try to see if any of them are admins, any of them are privileged. Once you get a good one, you move on and you move on. Eventually, they get pretty much to the entire organization, or at least the server infrastructure. At which point ransomware is switched on, and in this case it was Conti malware, an evolution of several families of malware. Every year or so there's new ransomware malware out there that is better at not being detected, not being stopped. Every time that there's countermeasures, then the malware gets better, right? That's kind of the arms race here. And yeah, and as you can see here, according to some sources, even an 80% drop in their ability to serve patients, and it's still ongoing. So what do you think, Brian? Anything special here that we should look at?
I think there's a couple different prongs to this. Yeah, part of this is, as much as it seems like the basics, it's things like having an advanced threat protection solution for email, whether that's the Microsoft Defender solution or something from a vendor like Proofpoint or FireEye or any number of those that's able to detect phishing emails, malicious attachments, and so forth, goes a really long ways. And we continue to see organizations that don't have solutions like that. It's not just about blocking, with antivirus or signature based, but it's a lot more complicated now to really detect these types of emails that so often are where these incidents start from. And then again, multi-factor authentication, again, it seems like it's 2021 and there's still so many organizations that don't have it out there. There's a non-trivial number of Office 365 accounts that are not protected by any form of two-factor authentication. And when you combine that with poor choices of passwords, with the successful phishing attacks, it just makes it way too easy to get into the front door. And then those are often the same organizations where things like making sure that end users don't have local admin rights on their workstation, so that when they download that piece of malware and click on it, it doesn't have full access to the workstation, the ability to do things like run Mimikatz that we talked about in the previous incident. Are super important. So it's an element of the basics, but the basics continue to be something that for many organizations are where they need to start.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember doing a reading that at least in Office 365 environments to this day, I think maybe 18% have implemented MFA.
Which is considering the sheer number of hundreds of millions of user accounts out there, is a staggering number that are vulnerable to things as simple as password spray.
Yep. All right. So what did we see? Common thread, Active Directory, right? Different attackers, different types of attacks, different impacts, whether it's state-sponsored APT attacks or common ransomware that we're seeing dozens of times and every day pretty much. All of them involve privilege escalation, lateral movement, persistence, all through abusing identity platforms. In this case, it's most of the times it's Active Directory, but any identity platform can be abused. Active Directory, because of its ubiquitousness and its age and its support of legacy systems, is usually easier to abuse. But any of these systems can be abused if they're not configured and managed in a secure way.
Yeah, I was just going to, if I could add in here, we spend a lot of time when we hear the news about these attacks, about what novel ways are used to gain initial access or to gain escalation, like the GoldenSAML attack, because it's interesting. But the vast majority of it, the threat actors are not doing it to discover novel ways. They want the tried and true pathways. And so that's where that's like the super highway of threat actors is Active Directory. And one thing I wanted to point out too is, as we have evaluated, because we have sat on a number of customer calls as they have, our customers, some small, some very large, have run Purple Knight. It is generally, I jokingly say, make sure your security people and your AD people have already taken their vacation before you run Purple Knight, because when you get the results back, all of a sudden, a lot of companies start scrambling because their results are so much worse than they would expect that they would be. So let's roll into another poll here. Let's put this poll up. So in terms of protecting Active Directory right now, what is an example of your primary security solutions for protecting AD? Are you using a SIEM? Are you using an active traffic monitoring tool like Microsoft Defender for Identity, formerly known as Azure ATP, formerly known as Advanced Threat Analytics, and et cetera, as Microsoft Marketing changes their names, or other tools? So let's see what we're seeing this showing up now. Coming along right now, actually, the winner is other. So let's share the results out. So this says to me that a lot shows up. You have a lot of solutions that you look at, not just some of the biggest ones, although SIEM and Azure ATP are up there.
Sean, I would venture to guess that a lot of companies, I know I was in several, and I've seen several have a lot of homegrown solutions. So they put together a lot of things based on, different scripts and stuff tied together from years and years of experience around Active Directory. And they use that often in conjecture with a SIEM or with other monitoring tools. So that's something I think we've seen fairly often, especially in Active Directory.
Right. Very interesting.
Okay, so looking at protecting AD just a little bit more in depth, we look at it in terms of before, during, and after an attack, right? What you can do to reduce your attack surface, what you can do to detect and monitor, and what you can do after you realize you've been attacked, and of course mitigating the impact. Brian, what can you talk about a little bit about before the attack?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously before the attack is our, preferred time to work on hardening AD and Windows environments, but certainly we get to learn a lot from, after the attack as well on how we can do better. We talked about some of the examples, we went through some really basic things to do, but then especially as we talk about privileged credentials, there's just a lot of work, and sometimes some non-trivial work to really take it to the level that it really protects those privileged credentials, your domain admins and so forth, and makes them much harder to go after. We talked about preventing lateral movement with laps, for example, but then as you go up the chain a little bit, typically we start with things like Are there service accounts in the domain admins group? How can we get that to as little as possible? Are there what we would call domain admin equivalencies, which are sometimes things that people look over, or they're a little harder to notice, but they're often really attractive targets for adversaries. So those are typically things that run on domain controllers that have the equivalent of domain admin access by way of running as local system, for example, and they can typically deploy code or run code on those machines. So a really good example is if you're managing your domain controllers with SCCM configuration manager or Microsoft Endpoint Manager, typically that runs as local system. You can use the console from that to deploy any application or any script you want to a system that it's managing. So if that includes your domain controller, someone that's at that point compromised the SCCM console can use that to elevate themselves to domain admin access by virtue of running something on a domain controller. And of course, it can be really hard to detect that because those changes that they may be making are actually running in the context of the domain controller. So it may look like normal day-to-day operations. So that there's lots of those out there. SCCM is just one example. But that can be challenging to unwind, but can be really, really important from a security posture perspective. Of course, operational processes, getting rid of old user accounts, old computer accounts, rotating passwords, all those sorts of things that we talk about all the time. Those are processes that you actually need to implement, and not just implement, but actually automate those ideally so that they're always happening. And then, of course, there become more complicated but higher value things, like, for example, implementing privileged access workstations, where now people aren't using privileged credentials on their day-to-day workstation that's also used for reading email, browsing the internet, and so forth. But instead, those privileged credentials are only touching a machine that we've secured, we've hardened, and we've made sure that it can really only access the things that it needs to do. And as you start to put all those pieces together, you start to get a program that really protects privileged credentials and makes privilege escalation AD much, much harder.
Right. Well, regarding monitoring and response, I think it's important to say that for identity platforms and AD specifically, we're used to thinking about monitoring response in terms of a SIEM doing correlation on logs or network traffic and things like that. But when it comes to Active Directory, there's several things we should pay closer attention to, and those are the kind of internal changes within Active Directory, attributes and ACLs being changed, things like that. Just as an example, Darren Marelia from Semperis uncovered a vector for carrying out attacks by changing display attributes within Active Directory. Right, that's something that can enable lateral movement and persistence in a domain without leaving any logs behind. Right, so there's a lot of kind of small changes that attackers can do in Active Directory that can carry a lot of weight in terms of an attack, but that aren't detectable through normal log behavior. So it's really important to monitor changes in Active Directory, do anomalous behavior detection in those types of environments. As you mentioned, Brian, look at the privileges the users have and look for the shadow admins, right? The users that are not in your privileged groups, in your monitored groups, but they do have ACLs that make them privileged, either over specific applications or things like DC synchronization rights that they may have without being in protected groups and things like that. And of course, have playbooks ready to respond, right, for any type of these or for these types of attacks.
And I think that's a really good point too about the correlation with collecting this data in a SIM tool. It's not just about collecting event logs and, hey, we see event number 123, we need to trigger an alert, but it's really about using some of that, correlation, machine learning, pattern detection, and so forth to see where are the anomalies here, because changing a couple of attributes happens, in a large organization every second, quite literally, but changing a volume of them over a small period of time or changing a certain sequence of them can be a much different indicator.
Right. Okay, so I think we have questions. So just a few words maybe about Semperis and Ravenswood. So Semperis, our products are designed to protect Active Directory before, during, and after the attack. Directory Services Protector is our on-prem solution to cover hybrid identity environments, looking at changes to the identity management platforms, as well as indicators of compromise and indicators of exposure, being able to alert you in real time for the types of things that we showed today, specifically targeted at the hybrid identity environment, Active Directory, and beyond. Our second product is the Active Directory Forest Recovery. This is for after the attack. So this solution creates backups in time of the Active Directory environment, the Active Directory layer itself, without reliance on the underlying operating system, so that if something does happen, whether it's a cyber attack or even an administrator error, you have a big red button to push, and you can redeploy all of your Active Directory environment without being afraid of reintroducing malware to that environment. And finally, as we've mentioned several times, Purple Night is a product we released just a couple of months ago, and where we leveraged our years-long knowledge of these identity environments to create very focused indicators of exposure and some indicators of compromise into a portable tool that you can download and run anywhere. All you need is domain membership, no special privileges required. You run it, you get a scorecard of your AD environment with remediation information and detailed description of everything that the tool found. Very, very powerful, as we've seen hundreds and hundreds of customers use this and really get insights into what's going on within their Active Directory environment that they were just not aware of beforehand.
Yeah, and I think our team at Ravenswood, we focused, while Semperis is really on the product side of things, 100% on professional services, and everything we do is really around the Microsoft identity and security stack. So we do a ton of work with securing AD both before and after the incident, as we kind of talked about what some of those controls were, whether it's things like implementing tiering or the new model that Microsoft has, privileged access workstations, and other AD hardening tests. And then on the cloud side of things, we do a ton of work around the Microsoft identity and mobility products like Azure AD, Intune, and the advanced threat protection products. And then, we combine all that from a health and remediation perspective with Semperis's Purple Night tool, as well as some of our own health check offerings.
So what are your next steps? I think it's pretty clear here that, and the reason that you're attending this is because you recognize that Active Directory is a weak link and that you need to strengthen it. My strong suggestion is because it is available, and as you may be able to see in the chat, it's available as a free tool download here, and it requires no rights in the domain to run. It doesn't even require any rights on the workstation or the server you're running it from to execute it. And it looks at your Active Directory environment the way an attacker would, and looks for the vulnerabilities of it. And it will give it to you ordered, the indicators of exposure. I think, Ron, we're up to 63, 65 indicators of exposure now.
Yep, 70.
Oh, 70. See, it was climbing all the time. Download it, take a look at it, evaluate where you stand in it, and improve your security posture. So I'd like to thank Brian and Ron, certainly, and of course everybody for attending and contributing to both the polls and the questions. And say that today's webcast was sponsored by Semperis and in association with redmondmag.com. Hopefully you found it useful. If you do have any other questions related to us, please feel free to drop us a line. We're happy to we're happy to follow up and get some information. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.